Charles Bronson was not difficult to understand. He was difficult to enter. People confuse those two things. They assume that if someone is hard to reach, they must be hiding something. In Bronson's case, there was nothing hidden. There was simply nothing offered without reason. He did not believe in constant openness. Not because he distrusted people, but because he understood cost. Every interaction costs something. Energy. Attention. Expectation. Most people spend these without noticing. Bronson never did. That made him appear distant. But distance was not the goal. Stability was. Loneliness didn't arrive suddenly in his life. It accumulated. Quietly. Gradually. Almost politely. It showed up not as absence, but as fewer interruptions. Fewer invitations. Fewer people who felt comfortable crossing his boundaries. He noticed it, of course. Anyone who claims not to notice isolation is lying. But Bronson didn't interpret loneliness as something broken. He saw it as a byproduct. A natural consequence of a system designed for stability, rather than connection. Most people build their lives around exchange. Emotion for emotion. Attention for attention. Energy for energy. Bronson learned to build around conservation. You don't give unless it's necessary. You don't spend unless there's return. You don't open unless there's trust. That model works exceptionally well in dangerous environments. It works less well in intimate ones. This is where misunderstandings deepened. People wanted access. He offered presence. People wanted reassurance. He offered consistency. People wanted reaction. He offered restraint. To them, it felt cold. To him, it felt correct. Because overreaction had never kept him safe. Precision had. Bronson didn't escalate situations. He exited them. Not dramatically. Not loudly. Early. That habit confused people. They expected conflict. They got closure. They expected negotiation. They got finality. He wasn't trying to win. He was trying to remain intact. That distinction matters. Most people stay too long. They explain too much. They compromise past the point of recognition. Bronson rarely did. Not because he lacked emotion. Because he had learned what emotion costs. When the environment is unforgiving. Once you learn that lesson deeply enough, you don't unlearn it. You carry it into every room. Every relationship. Every silence. And eventually, people stop asking why you are the way you are. They just say you are, that way. Unmoved. Reserved. Hard to reach. They mistake the surface for the structure. What they're really seeing is a man who built himself to endure pressure without leaking. Not everyone is built to connect deeply. Some are built to last. Bronson was one of those men. Bronson never explained his limits. He didn't announce them. He didn't justify them. They simply existed. And when someone crossed them, he didn't react. There was something else people felt around Bronson. Even if they couldn't name it. A sense of calibration. When he entered a space, the temperature didn't rise. It settled. People spoke a little slower. Chose words more carefully. Paused before filling silence. Not because he demanded it. Because he didn't rush to relieve discomfort. Most people are uncomfortable with quiet. They explain. They joke. They soften edges. Bronson didn't. Silence stayed where it was. And silence, when it isn't immediately fixed, becomes revealing. It shows who needs approval, who needs control, who needs reassurance. Around Bronson, those needs surfaced quickly. Some people leaned in harder, trying to provoke reaction, trying to confirm they still existed. Others pulled back, unwilling to be seen that clearly. Bronson didn't adjust either way. He didn't reward intensity. He didn't chase withdrawal. He stayed exactly where he was. That steadiness acted like a mirror. People saw themselves more sharply in its presence. And many didn't like what they saw. This is how the idea of intimidation formed. Not from threat. From contrast. When someone is emotionally economical, your excess becomes obvious. When someone doesn't explain himself, your explanations start to sound like justification. Bronson never asked people to measure themselves. They did it automatically. And that created distance. Not dramatic distance. Structural distance. The kind that grows. Without argument. Without conflict. Without resolution. People drifted away. Not because they were pushed, but because there was nothing to hold on to. That required performance. He wasn't cold. He was complete. And completeness leaves little room for negotiation. This is where loneliness became visible. Not loud. Not painful. Functional. Loneliness, for Bronson, was not emptiness. It was space. Space to think clearly. Space to remain unaltered. Space where nothing tugged at him. From the outside. Most people fear space. Because space forces self-contact. Bronson had already learned to live there. That's why solitude didn't scare him. It felt familiar. Like an environment. With known rules. No sudden demands. No emotional ambush. Just quiet continuity. But intimacy. Real intimacy. Requires a different risk. It requires letting someone interrupt your system. Bronson rarely allowed that. Not because he didn't value connection. Because he understood interruption. Interruption breaks rhythm. Breaks focus. Breaks control. And control, to him, was not dominance. It was survival. Once control is lost, everything becomes unpredictable. And unpredictability was something he had spent his entire life minimizing. So people interpreted his restraint as emotional distance. They weren't wrong. But they misunderstood the reason. It wasn't avoidance. It was prioritization. When you build your life around staying intact, you learn to choose carefully what you let inside. Not everything deserves access. Not every relationship deserves vulnerability. Bronson wasn't cynical about this. He was realistic. He had seen what happens when people give too much to environments that don't protect them. He had seen the cost of emotional generosity in places where it couldn't be repaid. So he adopted a quieter rule. Give less. Observe more. Stay grounded. That rule followed him everywhere. And over time, it shaped how others remembered him. Not as warm. Not as cruel. But as someone solid. Someone who didn't bend. Someone who didn't fracture under expectation. That solidity is rare. And rarity often reads as distance. But distance was never the goal. Endurance was. And endurance, by nature, stands slightly apart. He withdrew. That confused people more than anger ever could. Anger gives you something to push against. Withdrawal removes the surface entirely. Most people interpret withdrawal as punishment, as passive aggression, as manipulation. Bronson never used it that way. For him, withdrawal wasn't a message. It was a correction. A quiet adjustment. Back to equilibrium. He understood something most people learn too late. Constant availability is not kindness. It is erosion. The more accessible you make yourself, the more people assume access is permanent. Bronson refused that assumption. Not with speeches. Not with ultimatums. With consistency. Consistency is uncomfortable. Because it doesn't bend to mood. It doesn't soften under pressure. It doesn't reward persistence. It simply remains. People tried to read him emotionally. They failed. Because his emotional language was not expressive. It was structural. You didn't feel him in reactions. You felt him in patterns. He showed up when it mattered. He stayed when it counted. He left when it stopped making sense. No drama. No warnings. That lack of explanation frustrated people. They wanted to know why. But why is a luxury question. And Bronson never treated life as a place where luxuries were guaranteed. He had learned early that environments don't adapt to you. You adapt to them. Or you break. So he adapted. He simplified. Reduced inputs. Reduced noise. Reduced emotional leakage. Over time, that reduction started to look like detachment. But detachment wasn't the goal. Preservation was. Preservation of energy. Preservation of clarity. Preservation of self. Most people trade these slowly. For comfort. Bronson didn't trust comfort. Comfort made people careless. Carelessness made people vulnerable. He had seen enough vulnerability. Enough collapse. Enough moments where one small misjudgment had irreversible consequences. So he learned to live with a narrow margin of error. That margin followed him everywhere. Into conversations. Into friendships. Into silence. This is why people often felt they were kept at arm's length. They were not out of cruelty. Out of discipline. Discipline is often mistaken for lack of feeling. In reality, it is feeling under control. Bronson felt deeply. He just refused to let feeling drive behavior. That refusal is rare. And it makes people uneasy. Because most relationships are built on mutual reaction. You respond to me. I respond to you. Bronson interrupted that loop. He didn't escalate emotion. He neutralized it. Not intentionally. Instinctively. Over time, people stopped pushing. Not because they were afraid. Because there was nothing to gain. No emotional leverage. No dramatic payoff. Just a man who stayed the same. Regardless of expectation. That kind of steadiness exposes instability in others. And most people don't like what they see when that happens. So they labeled him cold. Distant. Hard. Labels are shortcuts. They save effort. Bronson never corrected them. Correction requires engagement. Engagement invites negotiation. He wasn't negotiating. He was maintaining. Maintaining the internal balance. That kept him functional. That kept him standing. And once a man builds his life around not falling apart, everything else becomes secondary. Approval. Belonging. Even closeness. Not because they don't matter. but because they are not worth. The cost of collapse. This is where people misunderstand him most. They assume he chose distance. He didn't. Distance chose him. Once he chose stability. That trade-off is not dramatic. It doesn't feel heroic. It feels quiet. And final. And once it's made, you don't go back. What people rarely talk about is the cost of being unshakable. Stability protects you. But it also isolates you. When you stop reacting, others lose their reference points. They don't know where they stand with you. They don't know how to move you. They don't know how to matter. And most people need to matter. Out loud. Bronson never offered that reassurance. Not because he withheld affection, but because he didn't believe. Affection needed constant proof. He believed that if something was real, it didn't need to be refreshed daily. That belief made relationships thinner. Cleaner. But thinner. People stayed at the edge of his life, instead of inside it. They knew where he was, but not how close they were allowed to get. That uncertainty kept them cautious. Caution slowly becomes distance. Distance becomes habit. And habit becomes loneliness. Not the dramatic kind. The quiet kind. The kind that doesn't ache. But doesn't warm either. Bronson accepted that. He didn't fight it. Because by then, he understood the equation clearly. Every man builds himself around something. Some build around belonging. Some build around admiration. Some build around control. Bronson built around endurance. Endurance demands sacrifice. It sacrifices softness. It sacrifices spontaneity. It sacrifices emotional excess. In return, it gives you something else. Stability under pressure. Clarity in chaos. The ability to stand still, while others collapse inward. That trade made sense to him. He had lived in environments where collapse wasn't poetic. It was final. So he chose the version of himself that would survive longest. Even if that version was harder to reach. Even if that version stood alone more often than not. People sometimes confuse loneliness with regret. They assume that if someone is alone, they must be missing something. Bronson didn't experience it that way. He didn't long for what he had given up. Because what he gave up had never felt safe to begin with. He didn't walk away from connection. He limited it. Carefully. Intentionally. Until only what could coexist with his internal structure remained. That left fewer people. But it left him intact. And integrity, once preserved long enough, becomes visible. Not loudly. Not proudly. But unmistakably. People sensed it in him. That he wouldn't bend to mood. That he wouldn't fracture under pressure. That he wouldn't trade himself for acceptance. Some admired it. Some resented it. Most didn't understand it. Understanding requires proximity. And proximity was something he rarely allowed. So the image remained incomplete. A man seen from the outside. Solid. Still. Misread as cold. Misunderstood as distant. But in truth, he was simply aligned. Aligned with the rules that had kept him alive. Aligned with the discipline that had prevented collapse. Aligned with a version of himself that didn't require permission to exist. That alignment cost him closeness. It cost him ease. It cost him warmth. In ways no one ever wrote about. But it also gave him something rare. Continuity. A self that didn't change. Based on who was watching. A center that didn't shift. Under expectation. A man who didn't belong to rooms. Or groups. Or approval. He belonged to himself. And once a man makes that choice, everything else rearranges around it. Not dramatically. Quietly. Permanently. That is why Charles Bronson was the way he was. Not because he was hard. But because he refused to break. And once you understand that, the silence around him finally makes sense.